All right, we're recording. It's October 11, and we've got a few things to get through. First off, well, actually, let me wait. I think Nick said he was going to join on the changelog. We really are awfully close. It feels like we've been on the edge of releasing RC2 for quite a while now. Got a little bit of extra unexpected suggested changes, which I think are were positive, but those have all been merged in now. So I think, Nick, I think there's just one tiny change to, well, a couple of tiny changes to the changelog now after that latest PR merged.
Pull the changes out of that one and merge them in. I'll do that in a minute,
Cool.
actually, while I'm in some conference talks.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, then I think it should be good for RC2, right?
I think so. I've pinged Dan and Tim one more time to make sure that they're good with this, but their comments on the Signet review PR makes it sound like they were. So I'm looking for that final bit of confirmation, but I think we're good to go here. And again, this is RC2, so I think we'll be all right. Yeah. So that's everything for RC2. I'm excited to get it out. Thank you everyone for the patience on this one, but excited to see the other side of it. Any questions or comments on RC2 before I move on?
Last thing from me, I'd say once I update that changelog PR and get it merged, I will probably be done for the day reasonably soon. But so I will. Do you mind pushing the buttons on this one, Rob?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, thanks for confirming there. Yep. Cool. Thanks for all the help with getting this changelog out.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool. All right, so I wanted to revisit this doc that is, I think we discussed this meeting or two ago about gateway API versioning and what it means once we hit V1 Alpha 2, what we're doing from that point on. And I think most of this was fairly non-controversial until we got to this section, the experimental or alpha fields or whatever we want to call it. And so based on that, I went through and went back and chatted with Jordan and Daniel just to come up with other ideas. And one idea, which I think may be my favorite so far, is to take advantage of CRDs as what they are. And instead of trying to re-implement feature gates, instead of trying to build our own custom versioning, whatever we want to call it, we could release different versions of the API, which sounds a little bit scary on the surface, but basically we could say, this is our stable set of features included in V1 Alpha 1 or V1 Alpha 2, V1 Beta 1, whatever it happens to be. And over here, we've included all those plus some experimental fields in this other CRD. If you want those, install the experimental version of our project. Otherwise, stick with the stable set of fields that we release by default. It's a way for users to control fairly easily if they're using our experimental fields. It gives us the ability to add and remove things into an experimental kind of state. And it seems like a fairly straightforward approach. Instead of, if you're familiar with Kubernetes upstream, you have these feature gates, and you have a feature gate per concept. This idea is really just, you either have the experiments turned on or off. It's basically all or nothing. And it, I think, adds very minimal amount of effort, at least from the API development perspective. But there's a lot to unpack in that. I think it's a relatively simple concept that I may not have explained very well here. But I'm interested if anyone has questions or thoughts on this idea of, instead of feature gates, instead of different API versions per se, just releasing, experimental CRDs along with our stable track. So you have a stable track and an experimental track of this API. Any thoughts, questions, concerns?
I think it's a much better approach than what we were looking at.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it works. I think it would work well. And I think it looks like from what you've written here in the doc, clear understanding that just because something's in experimental doesn't mean it would be in the next release or any future release. I think that's good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly the idea here. It's a way to test out new features, which we really do need. But for that to be purely opt-in and with the very clear understanding that when you're using an experimental version of any CRD, the next version of that CRD could remove a field because you're in the experimental world. It's not ideal. I really wish we could, some of the thoughts that came out of that is I really wish we could expose functionality like kubectl beta, or, like have CLI kind of experiments of, this field doesn't exist in the GA API. Did you mean to use the beta API? And you could have, some tooling and whatever. And I think that's a good goal to get to, but that's not currently exposed in kubectl and not something that we can really solve on our own. And in light of, until something more advanced is available, this seems like one of our best ways to accomplish this in a relatively simple way. I don't know, any other thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'm +1 on the experimental version of the CRD, as long as I think we'll just need to be careful about how we write the contract around it and what we expect the implementers to do and that sort of thing. Because the implementers, the cost that this puts is that implementers need to, effectively handle like two API groups or something like that. Two copies of the same thing. That where one of them may have some extra fields or something.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think we have to be careful about the contract here, and I do need to spell that out a little bit more. What we've done in Kubernetes upstream is whenever you're adding a field, the absence of that field cannot, or the default value of that field cannot meaningfully change how a resource is interpreted, basically. And so we need to have very clear limitations on how we can add things. And then similarly, we need to recognize and document that implementations may not support experimental features of the API. This is by definition an experiment. This is something like we're testing out to see if it makes sense, and if we get broad support and broad interest, then it may graduate to become a stable field. But I think we would need to document very closely that these really are, experimental fields, that both experimental and stable tracks of this API would have the same subset of fields, and that's all the stable fields. And experimental ones just potentially add some more. So it definitely need to be very careful with how we present this. But I think after having this brief discussion, I think it seemed like one of our least, probably our least bad option out there. My goal in presenting it here today is I wanted to get, our community perspective on this. And if it seems reasonable among this group, then I want to try and run this concept by API machinery, just to make sure, and there's overlap in all cases with the people we're talking to here, but I just want to make sure that what we're proposing here is a reasonable use of CRDs and, lines up with how we might want other APIs like ours to accomplish this kind of thing. But the real goal here is just to make sure that this approach actually seems reasonable to our community before we try and push it anywhere else or suggest it anywhere else.
So yeah, like I said, I think I'm +1 on the idea with the caveat that we need to be really careful about that and how it's going to play with the conformance stuff that I'll talk about in a week or two.
Yep, cool.
So experimental features, this will always be additive, like new fields, not removing or changing the meaning of existing fields, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, okay, that it will always be additive to the stable API, but within, you know, once something is added to experimental, it doesn't mean it will always be in experimental. It could be removed at some point.
Okay, well, I'm just wondering because of something Nick said. It seems like it wouldn't be too burdensome for implementers if experimental features are always additive.
Yeah, agreed. It's just I was talking more about I should be clear that yeah, I consider that that's a requirement, that the experimental stuff always needs to be an additive superset of the fields available in the stable API. I was considering more about how we would actually do this. It feels to me like it would be likely that we would do this with a different API group, probably the same object in a different API group, that like experimental.gateway or something like that. And then in that case, you've got to have the CRD registered, watch the CRD separately, that sort of stuff. You just got to have separate informers, all that sort of thing.
That's actually a good distinction. In this mindset, I actually planned on having them within the same API group. So you can choose to install experimental or stable APIs, but they don't coexist really, right? Like you only really have one, because experimental is just a superset of stable. There's everything in stable is already there. You just have some extra fields. Unfortunately, Kubernetes API machinery really does not play well when you have identical resources in two different API groups, as we're already finding out. So I think this is probably best kept in the same API group. And then specifically, I didn't actually call this out, but I think communicating with annotations on the CRDs themselves that, I thought I had written this out somewhere, but basically communicating that each CRD is specifically part of this bundle version, so 0.4.0, and it's part of the stable track. So you have annotations on every CRD to document which release they came from. Not perfect, but I think this is a direction that will be somewhat easier to understand than any of the alternatives out there that I can think of.
Yeah, I think it sounds fine. And again, it seems like the best option that I can conceive of as well. I'll be very interested to hear what the API machinery folks have to say about sort of different versions of things not having a different version.
The way it was described, I forget who actually suggested this to begin with, but it was basically feature gates don't make sense in the world of CRDs when you can just change your API dynamically. You know, when you can add and remove fields as, you know, by modifying the CRD itself instead of trying to change things on the other end. And so just by, you know, a build flag, you can say, okay, include experimental fields. So it's basically taking the idea of feature gates from API server to build level, build flag kind of concept. So hopefully it makes sense, but I am also very curious what kind of feedback we get from broader SIG API machinery community. I think what I'm going to do is send out an email to the mailing list sometime soon, and then add it to the agenda for their next meeting, which I think is around a week away. But if you have any thoughts, I'll leave this kind of to linger for a little bit. And if anyone has any thoughts or suggested changes before I push it out to the broader community, let me know. Cool. All right, well, thanks for the feedback on that. And I think the rest is pretty short today. I did want to cover this well-known options discussion for TLS config. It seems like we're all pretty agreed. I haven't actually replied to this one myself, but I agree with what everyone else has said here, specifically Harry's suggestion that it could help just to standardize on these options, but not necessarily be too prescriptive about how they're implemented or what it means to be conformant, but just standardized terms for specific things such as min TLS version. I don't know. I think we mostly have consensus here. Does anyone disagree with where the conversation is going, or have any additional thoughts they'd like to add on this one?
I feel pretty strongly about the namespacing the keys here for stuff that is implementation specific. You know, my one, like the ones for Contour, will be project_contour.io/setting name or something like that, just so that we don't end up with people sort of claiming a specific name/behavior in the short version, the non-namespace version. I think the non-namespace version should be part of the public API for gateway APIs.
I agree with that. I am actually surprised. Thank you for calling that out. I'm surprised we don't already have that restriction in place here. But if we don't, we should have it. And you're probably completely right there. So agreed. Okay. And the last thing I had, this will be a quick meeting, I think. This is just rough notes of the things I had in mind for the next few weeks of meetings. We're really, nearing the end of the V1 Alpha 2 cycle. And so I just wanted to paint a broader picture of what I had in mind for the coming weeks. Conformance, I think, is really going to be a big topic. Nick, you've been working or thinking about a doc on conformance profiles that overlaps pretty heavily with how we structure our conformance tests. But I really want to have some, discussion, documentation, etc. Maybe a gap around these kinds of concepts. So I imagine that's going to be a fairly big theme in the coming weeks. And then there's a couple features that we really started discussion a month or two ago about redirects and rewrites and L4 route matching. I'd like to follow up on those discussions and see if we can include them. We basically said, well, this is additive. We can do it after V1 Alpha 2. And well, once we get to V1 Alpha 2, I do want to bring these back in. But my first focus, I think, or our first focus should really be conformance. These are just the ideas I have in my head and what's on my mind for the coming weeks. But if anyone has any other direction they'd like us to head, as far as gateway API, as far as what we're working towards, feel free to add it to this list, post in GitHub, Slack, wherever. But just wanted to give some kind of outline for what could be next. Does this match up with what others were thinking here? Anything else I should add?
What about the kind of delegated multi-tier routing? Rather the conversation that Nick, you'd really started this, I think.
Yeah, route inclusion. Yeah.
Yeah,
You're completely right. I don't know how I missed that. Yeah, we had a gap that covered part of that, and then yeah, that's a good one. Thanks.
yeah, that's one we're pretty interested in.
Good to know. Yeah, I'm glad there are more people interested in this. I think one of the questions that we're going to have here is whether we call this route delegation or inclusion, right? There are some use cases where, where I see delegation is the one-to-many, and inclusion I see one-to-one. Maybe that's not the right use of those terms, but I think that fundamental discussion of, is this just, I want to include a specific route, or I want to include, delegate everything under /foo to this namespace. And I think that'll be a good discussion to have there. And Jeff, you mentioned you have a specific use case for this. Is this, does it fall into one or more of those categories I was describing, out of curiosity?
Yeah, it's I don't know that we've thought about it in those specific terms right offhand, so I don't know if I can answer you. I guess we've got users where they need to be able to do a kind of a second tier decision on routing.
Yeah.
And you could accomplish that by doing it at the first tier, but if you're trying to delegate control, if you will, down to other groups, that doesn't work so well. And so that's why we see the need for this kind of a two-tier model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That lines up with our initial use cases with this, and it's good to have another fairly concrete use case for this kind of feature. So one more reason to revisit that sooner than later. Great. Any other topics that we may want to cover in the coming weeks here? Cool. Okay, well, I will leave it at that then. I know it's KubeCon week, so everyone's probably going in between a bunch of different things. But thanks for the great feedback and discussion on this. Hopefully we can get RC2 out awfully soon. And with that, I think I'll call it a meeting, unless anyone had anything else. All right, have a great one.